All right, I want to give you guys the Dare Group message recap. We talked about humility this past week and how Jesus humbled himself to go to the cross, and how we're invited to humble ourselves in the same manner. Now, we're not supposed to go to a cross like Jesus literally did, but there's that invitation to humility. And the point is that humility is costly. Whenever there's humility in any situation, it's cost somebody something for humility to be present. And so we talked about three things that humility says. The first thing is humility says, I am wrong. I was wrong. That's so hard to do at times, and yet it is a key to repentance. We also talked about how humility says, my thoughts are not my God. And again, trading our thoughts for God's thoughts. There are things that we think about. We're not the architect of every thought that comes into our mind, and so we have to sift those out, and humbling ourselves by exchanging our thoughts for God's thoughts. So many times what happens is you won't necessarily even have smaller thoughts. You'll actually have bigger thoughts because God's thoughts are beyond ours. And then we talked about how humility says this, that I don't have to be proven right to do what's right. Because so many times we want to prove how right we are when Jesus says it's the greatest are those who serve. Remember the illustration of the Last Supper and the table, and how Jesus said those who humble themselves will be exalted and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And he used that illustration, if you guys remember, the table seating and all of that. And how Jesus, even though he didn't know any sin, he didn't have sin in his life, he took on our sin, he absorbed our sin, and how we can do that for other people. And that's the way of humility. And so a few things to think about. Maybe what you can talk about what your definition of humility is. What do you think of when you think of humility? Another thing is, do you have a hard time admitting that you're wrong? Many of us struggle in this area. Maybe you're one of those that it's just hard to do that at times. Also, maybe talk about this concept of humility, exchanging our thoughts for God's thoughts, because sometimes we think of humility as like being really, really small, and yet sometimes being humble actually opens yourself up to bigger things. Humility unlocks God's ability. What did you think about that? Do you wrestle with that? Do you think I've always got to be weak and small? And yet God says that it's in our weakness that strength comes, and that he wants to demonstrate the end result, which is strength in our lives. And that's an amazing thing. Or how about this one? Do you always have to be proven right before you'll do what's right? Are there areas of our life that we need to absorb the hit, absorb the pain, absorb the sin, walk in forgiveness, walk in humility? So there are some things to discuss there, a lot to discuss there. Humility, it's a topic that's sometimes hard for us to walk out, but it's so necessary for our growth. So Dare Groups, talk about it. Enjoy your Dare Group tonight.